It may not have been the most burning question within the gaming landscape, but Square Enix answered it nonetheless. What do you get when Alice in Wonderland meets Iron Man?
Batshit crazy?
Forspoken. That's what. Now, although the plot and world are not the most original, it does offer an emerging fish out of water in Frey, a redemption arc, learning skills, and finding her feet in more ways than one. Built on the Luminous engine that powered the team's last game in Final Fantasy XV, it does share a similar open world design, animation, art, creature design and more. But combat and traversal are the biggest changes of gear, with both being focused around parkour and fast fluid travel, dodge, lock-on and magical pyrotechnics. But before we get into the graphics, the quality and effects, let's play with those all-important numbers. Starting with resolution, in the game's 3 modes, doubled to 6 with that 120Hz screen option, give you quality, ray tracing and performance. With quality targeting 4K with DRS engaged, it can then scale by 75% in total, down to a low of 1920 by 1080. Next we have ray tracing mode that now reduces that ceiling to 2880 by 1620, all the way down to a low of 810p. Both these modes use FSR2 to reconstruct back to a 4K output when not at this level, which is always the case in that ray tracing mode and often in quality. Finally, performance now targets a new 2560 by 1440, both in its ceiling as a resolution and that FSR2 reconstruction. It can again scale by 75% down to 1280 by 720p, but it is again not often at either end and somewhere in between, approximately 1260p. However, this mode does boost performance to 60 FPS over the previous two, which are fixed at 30. Now for me, the image quality impact on performance is noticeable, but small enough for the gains it offers. They have added the perfect compromise though in that 120Hz mode, in theory at least, if you have such a screen. Once enabled, then both ray tracing and quality halve the difference to performance and run at 40 FPS, meaning effects and settings are identical to the non-120Hz mode, but DRS is often at the lower range in heavy sequences due to that 25% reduction in frame time. But in reality, this makes a minor impact to image for an improvement to the fluidity and control, which can be vital with such a fast-paced action-centric title. The engine has a high input latency, and running it at 30 FPS means we get median times of 225 milliseconds within the quality mode, being the worst of the lot, closely aligned with that ray tracing mode at 221 milliseconds. With the base 60 FPS performance mode being significantly better at almost half that, with a median of 115 milliseconds. And this is where the 120Hz screen offers the biggest boost, knocking some 30% off those quality and ray tracing mode times, now seeing 163 and 154 milliseconds respectively, due to that 25% smaller frame time, but also the fact it can now flip into an 8 millisecond refresh when a frame is dropped, bringing the median input time down by some 60 milliseconds. The 60 FPS performance mode does gain, but only the expected 8 milliseconds frame time peak, giving a small 7.2% improvement in fluidity. As such, without even getting to frame rates and performance, I suggest the 120Hz mode for all if you have the screen, and if not, then the performance mode, as both camera, movement and combat are severely hindered in that 30 FPS mode as demonstrated here. So in theory, we have all the bases covered from the menu, in theory. Sadly, in practice, all of the targets are missed, and not only on occasion, but often enough to be subpar. Starting with the best mode in performance, we target 60 FPS in any high fill rate and bandwidth heavy sections though, with foliage, opaque or partially translucent alpha effects, can all cause the game to dip 25 or 30% on those frame rates, causing long sections into the mid to low 40s. Now the game does support variable rate refresh, but the issue here is when at these rates, these low 40s, it is below the active range on the PS5's VRR, and you therefore can still see and feel these dips. Thus, some sections are fine and run well enough without VRR and better with it, but in others, you still have a sufficiently lower frame time and thus rate than the mode itself aims for, and that is not appeased with those 120Hz modes. Turning this on, then the performance mode is still capped at 60 FPS, but when drops happen, you can at least flip into the next 8 milliseconds, meaning that it's still the fastest and most responsive mode to play. The ray tracing mode is next, with it being around 8 to 14% faster than the quality mode when running on a 120Hz screen, but even then it can dip into the low 30s often enough to feel the same. This does not mean all the time, with many sections of quiet exploration or cutscenes hitting that 40 FPS high quite consistently, but assume that heavy combat will play out somewhere in the middle ground. The question may be asked, why not run an unlocked option for 60Hz screens? But as you can see here, the frame times leap between 16 and 33 milliseconds when forced into a 60Hz container, as I've done on this video feed. This is how you will view all footage here on YouTube, as it only runs at 60 FPS. But on a 120Hz screen, it can then match that 40 FPS rate at 25 milliseconds, as you can now see on screen with a flat line, and it feels smoother as the frame times are closer together and even now. That cadence of frame delivery is the most important part. Sadly, the quality mode is even worse than the ray tracing mode, and at 40 FPS it is more often sub that and can even dip into the mid-20s. Again, dense opaque pixel fill rate seems to be the main cause here. As such, the 40 FPS mode is great in theory, but in practice, the quality mode suffers most to not be worth it, and the ray tracing mode, although much better, is still not close enough to that 40 FPS target to be called a true middle ground option. Which is a shame, but it's commendable the team have made the effort to add this to the menu.
Keep your wits about you.
Very much in the room, thanks.
Visually, the game is a mixture of new and old. While geometry, lighting, shadows, global illumination, specular and more do look good, but with definite last generation seams and reflections, and specular standing out in quite a few places. Yes, polygon count on characters is good, materials are pretty good, and general facial and skeletal animation is certainly not bad. That said, it does look cross-generation good, with higher textures and assets over a potential PlayStation 4 version. Compared to Final Fantasy 15, it is superior, specifically in resolution and image stability, even compared to the Pro version here, but not to any generational looking degree, aside from improved assets and resolution. It does offer some current generation increases though, with quality offering a full 4K output, ray tracing adding in hybrid shadows with a soft penumbra with accurate contact hardening enhanced by more objects casting shadows, including on Freya herself, and increased ambient occlusion, but still of a screen space variety, as are shadows at times, which is true across all modes. Quality does increase LOD over performance and the ray trace mode, with further shadow cascades, imposter billboards are pushed out on foliage, and increased debris in certain areas. Ray tracing has the best image quality, with shadow cascades mixed with ray trace shadows within the first cascade, i.e. closest to the camera. And these give softer shadows, better ambient occlusion, but without side-by-sides, they're not significant enough to stand out to most players. However, quality mode is a little sharper, helped by that CAS sharpening past fidelity FX that's been implemented into the engine, but in reality both modes look similar enough to blend into one after a few minutes of play. within the ray trace mode improving most on the self-shadowing of characters and cutscenes, which are quite plentiful throughout the game. Now, character models are well constructed and realised, but suffer often in the cutscenes due to lower bone rigs than many modern titles, and a mixture of performance capture and keyframe animation. This, along with the leap in some cinematics over others, means you can have big gaps in model quality, lighting, materials and animation from scene to scene and even character to character. Again, none of this is bad, but the title feels and aims towards a Sony first-party release, and it can come up short in a few key areas. Textures are certainly one aspect, with map loading often running subpar assets in cutscenes, and it highlights that the engine and title itself still need some refinement here, as textures can be quite late loading in, leaving you with soft blurry textures and a last generation looking details on the PlayStation 5, which should not really be the expectation.
Hey, come on. I'll explain shit later.
Stop! You must stop. She can save us. She can end your madness.
Father!
Loading highlights the cross-generation roots the entire game really has. Even though this is a PlayStation 5 and PC only title, continuing a game takes less than 2 seconds, making excellent use of the SSD and I/O design of the PlayStation 5. Loading into a game is slower, just over 5 seconds. It's still very fast, but not as fast as the cartridge-like continue. The main issue though is the constant fade to black and loading you will see during your play. Admittedly, most are only 2 to 3 seconds at most, but the constant fade out and in and out and in stop-start nature of opening a door, leaving a fort, battling an enemy, or even in between a cutscene can create a disconnect from the game. This is compounded by many sections locking you in place aside camera movement until the UI, the dialogue or prompts have all loaded in. This is frustrating at times as it felt unrequired and restrictive, meaning that the game, although big cutbacks and effort would obviously be needed, does not feel like it is utilising some of the key aspects of current generation consoles and possibly could exist on the PlayStation 4. Feeling far more cross-generation at heart, which carries over into its entire narrative, story and gameplay.
Ideas?
Yeah! Make this go!
Now, when it comes to sound, effects are okay with decent mixing and production. Music, although far from bad, is repetitive and terribly mixed, with music clumsily fading in or out or just stopping whilst new tunes start.
To address the council.
Forgive me, I am odd and keen. All this woman is guilty of is surviving the corrupted lands.
This is compounded by poor mixing, which can leave voices fighting with music, and the dialogue is far from top tier. This means actors have to work with what they have, and sadly, that often comes up short, and this comes across in the performance and even capture at times. The issue here is, again, the game will be viewed as a PlayStation Studio title, and although it is not that bad on the sound production and delivery score, it does come up under the bar expected. Some of this may be technical bugs that can be ironed out, certainly in the mix, blending and delivery, but some of the blame sits with the delivery and certainly the writing, with far too much swearing at times that did become quite abrasive throughout my playthrough.
That's the stuff. Keep at it. All right.
It's alright as it can be.
Try to blend in with the crowd.
I could blend in a whole lot better if you shut the Well, the name's Frey, and it sounds like you don't think I'm up to the task.
Tanta Sila is the strongest and most formidable of all the Tantas. She controlled the army, crushing the weak, even without the weapons that I forged for her. Crushing them with her bare hands.
In summary, the Luminous engine was a revelation only 7 years ago with Final Fantasy XV, offering character models, hair, cloth and physics that rivaled the best in the industry. Forspoken betters that game in almost all aspects. The problem is, the gaming world, the quality and generations have all moved on since, and this engine has not kept pace. What it offers is a wide open land, high graphical quality and a wide range of modes, but sadly none of these hit the expected mark both in quality and consistency. I hope that patches can come that resolve some of the performance and quality issues noted here, as although far from terrible, the 30 FPS mode is very stable and correctly paced, but the input times are far too high to make it an enjoyable experience during combat. This means that the expectation on this title and certainly the PlayStation 5 is for a little more than what is ultimately offered here with Forspoken.
Your Highness, your anger will not serve us now. Tell Tanta Sila where she is, child.
And there ends another deep dive into engines, performance, pixels and all things video game related. If you enjoy what we do here on IGN, then keep it IGN Performance Reviews, and we'll catch you on the next one.
You will get back to where you need to be. Whoosh!
Yes, whoosh!